to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Southbury poet Faith Vicinanza. Welcome, Faith.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So glad to have you. I know you've been writing poetry for a very long time and have been involved in the Connecticut arts and poetry community for a very long time. So I consider it an honor to have you as a guest on this podcast. Would you mind introducing yourself and your background as an artist in many areas to our listeners?
Right. I think it's fair to say many. So I am a poet. I'm also a visual artist. And by day, I make my living as a cybersecurity professional that pays the bills. And so my career is also an art form. Technology is really an art form. And then when I was young, I sang in a folk group for a number of years, and I've only recently gotten back into singing. I do karaoke at several local karaoke programs. And I'm also a competitive ballroom dancer. So I have my hands and my feet and my voice in lots of different arenas.
That makes sense. We know poetry began as an oral form. We've only been writing things down for a couple thousand years now. Would you speak to the influence of all these other activities, including voice, on your poetry?
When my mother was a poet. She was a homemaker, but she wrote Hallmark verse, what I call it, Hallmark verse, her whole life. And she was always writing poems for special occasions. When I first had my children, they were the only grandchildren. So of course she doted over them. And when they were very young, every birthday she'd send them a little, original poem celebrating their birthday in their birthday card. So I was around that. And my mother was not educated. She had a high school education. My father actually didn't finish high school. And when I went on to college, I was the first one in my family to ever go to college. So I don't come from a lineage of highly educated people. And when I went to college, I went on a math scholarship. So technology, math, and science, those were my fortes. And I really came to poetry because as when I was young, my father was in the Navy for 23 years and we moved all the time. I was in 6 elementary schools and often the new kid on the block and didn't know a lot of people, right? Sort of had a solitary existence for much of my childhood. And I was never the kind of person who was gregarious and made myself known immediately when we went into a new school or a new environment. And writing and reading and music were significant to me because they were a solid, and it was a private world, right? You can be in this world that was your own. You didn't need to be out in the open world, out in the wild per se. And when I was young, I was actually always writing songs. I really started by writing songs. I was always singing around the house. And but I was also doodling all the time. And my father was an artist as well. He was in the Navy for 20 years, but he was also a very good artist. And he really pressed me to pursue visual arts. And I didn't get along with him. I write a lot about, what a difficult and unpleasant individual he was, but but he influenced me in terms of the visual arts. And so there's something about photography or painting or singing or writing poetry or writing songs that's very one person, it's a solo activity. And so a lot of that was because I, at a young age, entertained myself, right? I lived in my own little world. and carried that world with me when we always moved around in different places. Now, I only recently got into competitive dance about 3 years ago, and that's a very social kind of a activity, which is very interesting for me, very much a social community. But I spend most of my time in terms of my artistic expression, painting and writing poetry. But when I was young, I was writing songs. And what I think influences me as a poet is that there's a musicality, even though I'm a narrative poet. I was involved in slam poetry for about 10 years, which is very performance based. And I was in regional theater when I was young. So performing, singing, there's all of these different forms of artistic expression. And I think they all come into play when I write. And I typically write what I would call personal narrative, and mostly narrative. I know forms. I didn't formally study poetry when I was young, but when I became serious as an adult about my poetry, I did a lot of self-study, and I have a huge, of course, library of poetry books, and went to lots of I went to the Dodge Poetry Festival for years, and the mega poetry event, right? So I would say that the influence is that there's a musical cadence often, I get told, and I feel it in the way I write, even though it's narrative, mostly narrative.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that some of your first writings were songs. Was it in the folk genre? Was it also narrative?
Very much in the folk genre. And I think that, one of the things that influences me as a vocalist is the fact that I am also a poet, and I have a real appreciation for the language. It's not just the sound or the rhythm, right? The language of so of course I'm a fan of Leonard Cohen or Bob Dylan and those likes. So and I think I think that it's hard to separate, if you have a variety of ways in which you can appreciate or express yourself artistically, that they all sort of come into play no matter what you're doing.
You say that, and it makes me think of, working as a school teacher, we distinguish the STEM classes from the arts and humanities classes as if we had separate brains for these things. And
Right.
really, it's the integration of all of that art makes possible.
I agree.
Your immersion in so many different art forms really comes into play in your very powerful poetry. Do you have a poem that influences your writing, or has it had an influence on your writing that you could share with us now?
I have a lot of poets that I adore. I can go on and give quite a long list. But I will say that as an adult, when I came to really taking my own writing seriously and really looking at what other poets were doing, I just fell in love with Mary Oliver. She is my all-time favorite. And I have a lot of poets that I highly regard, and Vivian Shipley, I have a huge respect for her. Lisa Starr is another one in terms of current poets that I really love. Mark Doty, Stanley Kunitz, but Mary Oliver is just, I could go to sleep reading Mary Oliver. I just love to be with her words. And one of her signature poems I chose for today is called Wild Geese, and most people who know Mary Oliver know this piece. Wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft body animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
Thank you. Thank you. That is one of my favorite Mary Oliver poems, and she occupies a significant section of the bookcase in the house here.
Awesome.
He's such a prolific writer. She's somebody you grow with or grew with when she was with us. She gave us so much over time.
I totally agree.
What about that poem resonates for you, Faith?
Well, so one thing that I love about that poem and a lot of her writing is that it's dense. And I don't mean dense in terms of complicated. I mean, she says so much with so few words, right? You can pull that very minimal poem, very short poem, apart for a long time, and I love the way that she often in a lot of her poems has us look at the very minute details of the world and at the same time look at the whole of the world. I really like that view where it's such an encompassing view. And I love the idea that, your place in the family of things. I mean, it's just a killer last line. And, I think a lot of us do that, right? We're always looking for our place. And I've certainly spent my life figuring out what's my place in the world. And also wondering whether being an artist makes a significant contribution. And at this age, I believe that it does. I believe it's essential to our experience as a human being and to the world, to the solace and health of the world as a whole, right? So, I just love the way that she invites us in and she tells us a very complex story in a very simple way.
She does. And I think also the line about loving, was it the warm animal of your body?
Yes.
Who you are, and to remember that we are animal.
Right.
And driven by impulses and desires and needs, and they count.
I agree.
You growing up as a New Englander, those things come later. You sublimate those things and you get your chores done.
Oh, that's very well said.
And what about if we embrace those things that make us human or make us alive? Thank you for reading that poem. How has Oliver's body of work influenced your writing, do you think, Faith?
Well, I would say the most significant influence, because when I started writing seriously again as an adult, I was telling my life story. And so it's true in a lot of my writing. It's a personal narrative. And what's so wonderful about Mary Oliver is that she allows for the personal narrative, but she does it by this sort of it's almost a spiritual, and probably is a spiritual relationship with the natural world, right? So it allows for the personal narrative in a larger context, and I think that's one of the things I really love about how she writes.
Right. Would you share one of your own works with us as well, Faith?
I have a chapbook that came out recently, and most of the poems in it really are, like I say, personal narratives, but there is one that I think goes a little bit beyond the personal narrative. I think it's one that could be more applicable to a reader outside of the context of the chapbook. So it's called Unsung. I am the poet's pen, too often impatient, scratching out phrases of unfulfilled longing. I am the painter's palette, layered with color, enticing you to believe in dreams made palpable. I am the shelved notebook keeping secrets, long forgotten trysts, waiting to be revealed anew. Wildflower seeds gifted in a paper envelope, still unopened, Tomorrow's delight, if only you would sow me to a waiting patch of earth. I am the voice in song, not singing, the smile that is only for you, but you are not here. I am the yellow of riotous dandelions threatening your pristine lawn, the chaos of wren feather midday meant to startle you from your retreat. I am the silence that marks this waiting, hopeful that you will come again, adorn bare branches of this wintering tree I call myself with the pale of your breath. It is then I will force spring's buds, meant to delight only you.
Oh my goodness, what a journey from the journal to the personal longing and desire for the other.
Thank you.
Yeah, wow. I just thinking about that dandelion and the thread of the dandelion, so innocent and lovely. What's not to love about that? And bright and yet threatening. Wow. And that is part of the chapbook Arturo?
It's part of the chapbook Arturo, yes.
That is a very powerful collection of poems describing a very important relationship. In our conversation, you've talked about your mom writing Hallmark style poems for family, and you turning to the arts in your solitude growing up as a child moving from place to place. How would you describe the audience for your work now? And could you also just describe the breadth of your work? You've been writing for your life, right?
Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting question to ask. How would you describe your audience? When I began writing seriously again as an adult, I co-founded a group called the Landmark Writers. And it was with a friend of my husband's, Charlie Chase, and he had come to a housewarming. My husband and I had bought a house. This is almost 30 years ago. And Charlie and I hadn't met him before. So he came to the housewarming, and Peter introduced me to him and said, by the way, Charlie is a poet. So about halfway through the barbecue we were having, my husband's on the back deck and he's like cooking for everybody. Charlie and I go out to the front stoop of the house and we sit and talk poetry for about 45 minutes. And out of that, we formed we came up with the idea to form this writing group called the Landmark Writers. And very early in our existence, Charlie came across an article about this movement called Poetry Slam, or slam poetry. And we took a ride up to Boston and went to see a slam, and we ended up both participating in the slam. And out of that, we brought slam poetry to Connecticut, and we ran the slam scene in Connecticut for about 10 years. And what that did for me is it provided an opportunity to bring the theatrics into poetry, because that's what slam poetry is. It's very theatrical. And when Mark Smith founded slam poetry, he did it because he wanted to find a way to engage audiences. And how you engage the audience is that you make it a competition, right? A slam poetry is basically pitting poets against each other in a competitive format. And people from the audience get to judge them, partially on performance and partially on the words, contents of the poem. And it's a way to engage the audience in poetry and open up an American audience to an art form that doesn't get as much recognition in the United States as it does in other countries. And it was very successful. It's sort of waning right now in terms of popularity, but there was a while where it was very popular and it got a lot of people involved in poetry, and it was very popular with young people. And the thing about the audience relationship with slam poetry is it's like an actor on stage, and you have to be engaged with your audience. It's not the more what you would think of as staid or academic kind of readings, where a poet gets up there, reads from their works. They have academic credentials, 8 Ways to Sunday, but they're not in a relationship with their audience. And I remember going to see Octavia Paz in this huge church in New York, and thinking, he was just not at all relating to the audience, as good as he is, right? And I've seen many really stellar poets read publicly and not have a relationship to their audience. So slam really taught me about how to have a relationship to the audience. And for a while, it influenced my writing a lot, because I was writing with the audience in mind. And then I moved away from slam, and I became much more interested in how a poem works on the page, and that it has to really hold up on the page. It cannot just hold up on the stage, right? Lots of what I would call stage poetry, when you put it on paper and somebody goes and reads it sitting in a silent corner somewhere, it just doesn't work, right? It's not necessarily good on the page. So, even though my focus now is the poem needs to work on the page, it needs to be something somebody can take away and be sitting with, on their own and be in a relationship. But still, I want that poem to grab the reader the way a slam poem is meant to grab the audience, right? So I've really been influenced by my experience there, in terms of wanting the poem to be an intimate conversation with the reader. So I have a lot of attention. I'm not writing for the audience, but I have a lot of attention that if somebody's going to sit down and read it, I want them to feel who I am, to be in the conversation with me when they're reading my work.
Got it. And where can people find your work if they want to get more deeply engaged with your art?
A copy of my current book, Arturo, is at the Southbury Library. It's fairly recent, so I need to bring it to a bunch of the libraries. It's not on Amazon at this time, because it's just recently released, but people can certainly reach out to me. I have a bunch of copies on hand, of course. And I used to do a lot of readings. I was reading constantly. And but when my husband passed away, which has been 14 years ago, I backed away. I really stopped going to poetry events. I stopped being really publicly active, and I became a bit of a recluse for quite a few years. And I spent a lot of my time painting rather than writing. So I'm only just now getting back out there, and I routinely do the first Thursdays at Arts Escape. And I am planning a book launch at Arts Escape, where we're in the negotiations of setting something up for that. I'm also going to be doing a book party at Gallery 25. We're working on a date for that. So I'm just starting to really be more publicly active again.
Well, that sounds great. I think the world needs to hear you. I've been to some of those open mics at Arts Escape in Southbury, and it is a real treat to hear very thoughtful, very personal poetry shared in that environment. And even when it's on Zoom, it becomes a very personal experience. And I think it speaks well of our world, that there is a place for poetry yet, and that the technology gives us access to each other in a meaningful way.
Nice. I agree.
Where is Gallery 25?
So Gallery 25 is on Railroad Street in New Milford.
Okay.
And because I'm also a painter and a photographer, and I have my work on display there routinely. And so I'll be doing a book reading there in the near future.
All right. So somebody who's been so deeply involved in the public side of art as well as the private side, what would you say to people who feel like they're interested in poetry, but they're not able to write it? Would you have any words of encouragement for people who just want to play with language and see what happens?
So one of the ways that I've gotten back involved, I was a longtime member of the Connecticut Poetry Society, and I know you're involved with them and very familiar with them. And I've been involved with them for a few decades now. And there's a lot of really accomplished and established poets and a lot of new voices that come into that environment and find a safe space where they can hear other people's work. So I think it's important to be around other people reading their own work, having an open dialogue about their work. So one of the thankful for technology, and I'm glad that you're starting a local group, but there hasn't been a local group here in quite some time. And because of Zoom, I was able to last year join the Hamden group and to start to go again to a routine monthly critique where, you know, we bring one of our pieces, and I find it very beneficial to be in a group with other poets of different calibers, you know, and to be in a really academic discussion of the work. And there's always the heart felt emotion that gets discussed as well. You know, were people emotionally engaged? Were they emotionally moved? And then there's also the technical side of the discussion, and it's important. And you know, so we always have young people coming in to those kinds of groups who are looking to learn more, looking to be exposed, and really going, I'm a huge fan of going to readings, and I used to do it all the time. I'd go to 3 or 4 readings a week for many years, and it's a wonderful level of exposure. What you have to keep in mind when you go to a reading is that you're going to have somebody who's going to knock your socks off, and then you're going to have somebody where you hear their poem and you go, they shouldn't have been at the mic to begin with. And it's just what it is, right? But you need that experience. You need to have the experience of what works and what doesn't work, and you learn for yourself. You know, you hear something and you're going, that doesn't work, so I better not do that myself in my own work. Or you hear something and you go, wow, I wish I had thought of that, or I wish I had written that. And it influenced what you might write yourself the next time.
Thank you. I think poetry communities are very important. And, you know, like you, I have found that in the Connecticut Poetry Society offers that every month. So thank you, Faith, for joining us today for People in Their Poems podcast, and for shedding some light on your own work as well as Mary Oliver's and the place of poetry in life. We're very, very grateful for your time today.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's been a pleasure.
And in our podcast notes, we'll put links to the galleries that you mentioned and the other venues where people can enjoy both your art, your visual art, and your literary art. And we'll be on the lookout for more access to Arturo as the months roll on.